it's Keela and Kyle with Decise, and we're here to talk a little bit more about compliance and specifically why is compliance so frustrating? Kyle, you've given an example before, and I really like it, which is okay, say you have to prove you are abiding by all driving laws on March 2nd. Go.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
counterintuitive, right? It's
Sure.
frustrating. Like, how do you do that? And that is commonly what compliance professionals in each organization are faced with doing every day. And it's not just driving laws, right? There's a whole plethora of laws and regulations that apply to organizations. And so it's not easy. Just tell us a little bit about, kind of the frustrations that come along with compliance.
Yeah, well, you nailed it. I mean, it's frustrating for so many people. And the reason for that is compliance is somewhat unorthodox. We talked about compliance last time and we put it into these two sort of categories. On one hand, it's somewhat easier to prove that I am doing the things that I'm supposed to be doing. But what you just described was the reverse scenario, which is like, how do I prove that I didn't do something that I wasn't supposed to do? And so one of the very first things right off the top that I'd say is compliance can be frustrating because it's time boxed. This isn't about just demonstrating that you did the right thing today. Compliance audits generally have a 1 year in the arrears time period, in which case you need to be able to demonstrate evidence that you did abide by the various compliance regulations that you said that you were going to do. And this the speeding example is a good one. Like most of us can't even remember what we had for dinner 3 nights ago, let alone what we had for dinner 3 months ago. But with compliance in particular, it's this unorthodox thinking that you have to apply, which is almost like work backwards. So, how am I going to be able to show a year from now that I did what I said I was going to do? And how can I disprove that I didn't do what I wasn't supposed to do? How's that for double negatives, triple negatives there? But that's essentially, I think, just like the fundamental thing is like it's unorthodox thinking and it's time boxed. And so you kind of got to set some common sense aside and more think of it from a defensive posture. How can I prove this stuff a year from now so my future self isn't frustrated with me?
Yes, that it's not easy to do. There are some strategies though. What are some strategies that you recommend for companies to think about as they're trying to, prove they did or did not do something so long ago?
Sure, sure. Obviously, we draw a lot of inspiration from the processes that are used in software engineering. And, I'll answer that question by drawing on that same discipline here. You know, a control is really any sort of process that you're going to follow that helps you like improve your odds of realizing your business objectives. And control is a term of art in compliance, right? But the reality is most people think about and are using controls on a daily basis. They're just not using that term. And so in software engineering, for example, uh, testing is a great example of controls. You're proving usually the good side, the new side, as well as the old side. You're doing regression testing. It's honestly just like a collection of controls to prove this new feature that I released is working as I expected it to, and this fail scenario that I'm expecting to fail does indeed fail. And so, like some of the strategies that you can put in place is think about like a structured approach to assessing risk. So what are the like worst case scenarios that I think might happen? And then how am I going to respond to those? So it's the idea of starting everything with a risk assessment, both the good side and the bad side, and then doing some scenario planning for how you will respond to those adverse scenarios. And you do that with this idea of controls. And controls, to go like a layer deeper, there's different types of controls, and some of them are really, really good, and some of them are not as good. Okay. So, like, the absolute best type of control that you can have is something called automated preventative control. Sometimes you might hear that called a hard control. It's literally a process or a system won't let you violate what it's intended to control. And those are the best types of controls because they scale infinitely. So you can deploy it once and it can be relied upon hundreds or thousands of times. Heck, it could be in production for years. Like that is the absolute best type of control. And then when you step back from that, you have automated detective controls. And so a detective control is going to be something that, like, if a certain process is out of bounds or out of performance, it'll alert you and say, hey, you need to look into this. And so an automated detective control is going to require some degree of manual intervention to inspect and see what happened and why did it happen. And then now you start to get into some of the like lesser desirable controls. So you have manual detective controls, which is essentially I've got this long stream of data, but now I got to rely on a human to go in, organize it, interrogate it, interpret it, and do something with it. And then lastly, you have what's known as a manual directive control. And that is essentially me saying, Keela, don't do this. Or our code of conduct says you shouldn't do this. And while directive controls are good, I think at a policy level, to help sort of guide a company into and employees into like what's the right type of behavior to do, what's the wrong type of behavior to do. In a compliance context, like can't advocate strongly enough that you really can't rely on manual controls at all. You're not going to be able to show evidence the way we started this chat with this sort of unorthodox thinking. A manual directive control is going to be really, really hard to prove that it's working. So try to steer clear from those. But that's, I think, the strategy of, translating risk assessment into control definition and then trying to prioritize your implementation controls to the automated preventative, automated detective, and then only using manual review when you have to.
Okay, that's helpful. Good to know. I like just kind of thinking about some of those things that you're saying there is I imagine that even in your automated prevented category, that you still need to make sure that your controls aren't preventing the business from doing what the business needs to do. And so, like, just, a silly example is, well, data leaks from email, prevent all the email. We've got a great automated system. It can just stop all communications. Well, obviously that's going to prevent the business from going forward, right? So there's a balance between, being able to prevent and various different types of controls to make sure the business can proceed but that they're also followed and used. What are some like tips and strategies that you have?
I mean, I think it'd be fantastic if I could turn off email altogether and just didn't have to use it. You're describing like the paradox of controls from cybersecurity pretty well, which is like you can have the most secure system. You have a biometric, you have a multi-factor authentication, you have a long and unique password you have to reset every day, but like nobody's ever actually going to be able to clear that hurdle. So there's an inherent trade-off, between like the security of a certain control and the user experience, and the art of it is being able to kind of pull that down to the right balance. And so I said, when it comes to control strategy, it starts with a risk assessment. For big global
Mm,
nationals, they're going to operate in 190 plus countries. And some of the requirements for compliance are really rigid. You have to adhere to them. But some of them do allow for a little bit more judgment, a little bit more thought can go into, okay, what is the right amount of control that needs to be put in place to be able to demonstrate that we're adhering to a certain regulation? And that is where you can kind of, you know, um, pay a little deference to your employees and the user experience. When it comes to controls, like you can have the best automated preventative control, but to your point, if it blocks business, that's a bad system. Like a system needs to be measured by um, those that have to operate within it. So is it being used? Is it being embraced? You can't measure the success of a compliance system just by the compliance, like compliance auditors or the compliance department alone. It actually needs to be like heavily influenced by the users and measuring your employee engagement within that system to strike that right balance of yes, we can demonstrate compliance and it's not injecting so much friction into my day to day that I will take like any step to try to avoid engaging in that particular control.
when do you see that controls are most likely to be followed, and not slowing the company down?
I think, you know, a control system that looks and feels like software that employees love to use is going to be the best type of system. And so engineers in particular have an incredibly complex set of tools that they use. If you think about like a continuous integration, continuous delivery CI/CD pipeline, there are
Mhm.
standards, there are processes. You comment code and you commit code and you're thinking collaboratively. Like people are not inherently going to resist compliance for compliance sake, what I think you got to do is try to create that type of system that integrates these compliance controls into the existing processes that are already followed by employees and make them be so easy to interact with that it feels just like using your favorite piece of software. And if you can sort of hit those chords, you're going to get tremendous employee engagement. You're going to get employees that recognize the value of compliance and why you're doing it. And in that case, I think you get sort of just this tremendous acceleration of the value of a compliance system.
That's great. How can companies do that? I love that idea. I love the concept. It makes sense, as somebody who would need to abide by, the various laws and regulations. Yes, give me a tool I'm familiar with that makes it easy and comfortable for me. But how can companies actually go about doing that?
It's hard. Like it's hard, and I don't like. There's not a turnkey solution. Um, there's not one single like compliance management software product that we could just endorse and say do this and it will solve all of your problems. But I think the main thing is to start small and work iteratively. Like embrace the agile manifesto in understanding what are my key risks that I've prioritized as part of that risk assessment, and then how do I implement a control. And I think when you're implementing that control, to your point, think about how are you going to measure the control. And I don't just mean the effectiveness of the control, like an automated preventative control. We blocked 100% of all of these attempts. Okay. But what I actually mean is like, how do you measure the employee participation and engagement of the control as well? So you should have some sense of, am I actually using and embracing it, or are people working around it? And to your
Mhm.
earlier point, like if too much error prevention, blocking of the stuff and things employees should do, if that hinders inventive or creative work, the system is not working. And so think of it, I think, in sort of assessing the risk to understand what are those really key things that we have got to have in place. But when dispatching or implementing them, also be thinking about the user experience, the employee experience, so that you get a low friction but highly effective control. And if you do that sort of case by case, working your way from your highest risk to your lowest risk, ideally you'll strike that right balance of user experience as well as control effectiveness.
Awesome. Well, I love your interest and your passion in all things compliance and where compliance meets technology and finding better ways to be able to adhere to laws and regulations, but also make it easy for users to participate. So thank you. If you'd like to join in
Sure.
on the conversation, you can find us at deciseglobal.com. And until next time, see ya.
Thanks. Bye.